She was 19 and a widow, cast out with nothing weeks before the first freeze. In the autumn of 1879, with no family left to her and no money to speak of, Josephine Marsh was given $20 and told to disappear from the Virginia county that had been her home. She walked away with a single carpet bag, a hand-carved wooden bird in her pocket, and a deed to a worthless, abandoned Confederate supply depot deep in the Blue Ridge Mountains. But what nobody knew, least of all the man who sent her there to perish, was that hidden behind the depot's cold stone hearth was a wartime secret of Union gold and Confederate betrayal that would change her life, and the life of the valley, forever. Settle in, and let us know where you're watching from tonight as we tell her story. Josephine's life had not been one of ambition or wealth. It had been one of quiet competence. She was the daughter of a carpenter, Elias Kane, a man who spoke more with his hands than with his mouth. He had taught her the language of wood, the tight grain of oak that signaled strength, the pliable nature of pine, the way a well-seated joint would hold against a century of storms. He taught her to see the world in terms of structure and integrity. "Look for the plumb line in a man, Josie," he'd say, his voice smelling of sawdust and pipe tobacco. "And in a house. If it ain't true, it'll fall." He died of a fever when she was 16, leaving her with his tools and his way of seeing. It was this inheritance, more than any other, that would shape her. A year later, she met Thomas Marsh at a church social. He was not like the other young men, loud and preening. He was quiet, like her father had been, with kind eyes that seemed to notice the same small details she did. The way the evening light caught in a spider's web, the pattern of lichen on a stone wall. Thomas was the second son of Cyrus Marsh, the most powerful man in the county, a man who had emerged from the war between the states with his fortunes mysteriously and vastly expanded. While other families were ruined, Cyrus had built a timber empire, bought the local bank, and held the debts of half the valley's farmers. His house was a monument to his success, a stark white mansion that stood on a hill, looking down on the town with an air of cold authority. Thomas had none of his father's hardness. He loved the mountains his father was so ruthlessly logging, and he found in Josephine a spirit that matched his own. Their courtship was a series of long walks along creek beds and ridgelines, where Thomas would name the birds by their songs, and Josephine would point out the sound construction of an old settler's cabin, long abandoned. On their first anniversary, he gave her a small whippoorwill, carved from a piece of mountain laurel, its form so perfect she could almost hear its call. It was the most precious thing she owned. Their marriage was an affront to Cyrus, who had wanted a strategic alliance for his son, not a love match with a carpenter's daughter. He tolerated Josephine, but his disapproval was a constant chilling presence in the grand, silent house. For 2 years, Josephine and Thomas built a small, warm world for themselves within the cold fortress of the Marsh estate, a world of shared glances, quiet jokes, and the promise of a future lived on their own terms, far from the reach of Cyrus's ambition. That world shattered on a Tuesday in late September. A falling widowmaker at one of the logging camps, a branch that had hung suspended for years, finally broke free. Thomas was gone instantly. The funeral was a performance of public grief orchestrated by Cyrus Marsh, with Josephine a silent, ghost-like figure at its center. In the weeks that followed, the coldness she had always felt from her father-in-law intensified, becoming an icy, suffocating pressure. He seemed to look straight through her, his eyes already erasing her from the family portrait. She knew her time was limited. The love that had given her a place in that house was buried on the hillside, and she was now just a loose thread in Cyrus Marsh's meticulously woven tapestry of power and control. She spent her days in a daze of grief, clutching the small wooden bird in her pocket, its smooth surface a tangible link to the only real happiness she had ever known. The first colored leaves began to fall from the maples, a beautiful, terrible reminder that winter was gathering its forces in the high peaks, and she had nowhere to go. She was a guest in her own life, waiting for the final, formal notice of eviction. It was not a matter of if, but when, and she knew it would be a quiet, administrative cruelty, as clean and cold as a fresh-cut piece of steel. The end came on a Monday morning, 4 weeks to the day after Thomas was buried. Cyrus Marsh summoned her to his study, a room paneled in dark walnut that smelled of leather and ledgers. He did not ask her to sit. He stood behind his massive desk, a fortress of polished wood, and laid a small stack of papers on its surface. "Josephine," he began, his voice devoid of any emotion, "the estate has been settled. Thomas, in his youthful sentimentality, made no specific provision for you beyond the standard dower rights, which, given your short marriage and lack of issue, are negligible." He gestured to the papers. "The house, the contents, the land, it all reverts to the primary estate. To me." He slid a thin envelope across the desk. "This is $20. It is a gift, a severance, more than generous under the circumstances." He paused, his gaze as flat and hard as a winter river. "I have also had the deed to the old Confederate depot at Miller's Gap transferred to your name. It is a worthless property, of course, but it is a holding. No one can say I left you with absolutely nothing." The cruelty of it was breathtaking. The depot was a ruin, miles from anywhere, a place known to be haunted and unsafe, a shelter fit for animals, not people. It was a death sentence delivered with a lawyer's precision. Josephine did not beg. She did not cry. She looked at the man who had been her father-in-law, a man whose hand she had shaken at her own wedding, and she saw him for what he was, a builder who used broken lives as his raw material. She simply nodded. "I understand," she said, her own voice sounding distant to her ears. She took the envelope and the deed. "I will be gone by morning." She turned and walked out of the study, feeling his cold, satisfied gaze on her back. She went to her room, the room she had shared with Thomas, and packed her single carpet bag. She took her spare dress, a bar of soap, a small tin of matches, her father's whetstone, and a worn blanket. She folded Thomas's favorite flannel shirt and laid it on top. Finally, she took the carved whippoorwill from the mantelpiece and closed her fist around it. She did not sleep. She sat in a chair by the window, watching the moon move across the sky, listening to the house settle around her. It was a house of secrets, she knew. A house built on a foundation she was only now beginning to sense was rotten to the core. Before dawn, while the house was still dark and silent, she slipped out the back door, closing it softly behind her. She did not look back. The gravel of the long drive crunched under her worn boots, the only sound in a world holding its breath for winter. The journey was a slow, deliberate shedding of her old life. She walked east, away from the town where every face would be a reminder of her loss and her new, diminished station. The air was sharp, carrying the scent of wood smoke and decaying leaves. The sun rose behind the far peaks, casting long, skeletal shadows from the bare-limbed oaks and hickories that lined the road. People saw her. A farmer on his wagon, his face grim, gave a curt nod but did not stop. A woman sweeping her porch froze, broom in hand, and watched until she was out of sight. They were Cyrus Marsh's people, bound to him by debt or fear, and they knew better than to offer comfort to someone he had cast out. Their pity was a silent, useless thing. Josephine asked for nothing. She kept her eyes on the road ahead, her back straight, the carpet bag growing heavier with each mile. She walked all day, stopping only once to drink from a cold, clear stream and eat the last biscuit she had taken from the Marsh kitchen. By late afternoon, the main road had dwindled to a rutted track that began to climb into the foothills. The landscape changed. The tidy farms and pastures gave way to dense, tangled forests of rhododendron and pine. The air grew thinner, colder. This was the land Thomas had loved, and the familiarity of it was both a comfort and a fresh wound. He had taught her this terrain, showing her how to read the moss on the north side of the trees, how to find the game trails that were the mountain's secret highways. He had once pointed out the ridge where the old depot was located. They put it there for a reason, he'd told her. Good water, a defensible position, and a view clear down the valley. He'd set it as a point of historical interest, never imagining it would one day be her only refuge. As dusk began to settle, tinting the sky in shades of bruised purple and gray, a cold wind began to whisper down from the heights. It carried the first hint of snow. Fatigue was a heavy weight on her shoulders, and a deep ache had settled into her bones. She was no longer just walking. She was pushing against the encroaching darkness and the biting cold. Finally, as the last light failed, she saw it through a screen of hemlock and bare poplar. A dark, low shape against the sky, a squat, solid silhouette of hewn logs and stone, half swallowed by the wilderness that had been patiently reclaiming it for the better part of 2 decades. She had arrived at the place she was supposed to die, the place she would have to call home. The depot was a testament to forgotten purpose. It was smaller than she had imagined, a single-story structure perhaps 40 feet long and 20 feet wide, built from massive hand-hewn poplar logs, now weathered to a silver gray. The dovetail notches at the corners were a masterclass in carpentry, a detail her father would have admired. A low porch ran the length of the front, its roof sagging precariously where one of the support posts had rotted through at the base. The door, made of thick, cross-braced planks, hung askew from a single great iron hinge. The other had long since rusted away. Most of the window openings were just gaping holes, though one still held a few shards of thick, wavy glass in its frame. The entire structure was being slowly consumed by nature. Ivy clung to the stone foundation, and a thick mat of moss carpeted the north-facing side of the shake roof. Yet it was not a ruin. It was wounded, neglected, but its bones were good. The ridgepole was straight and true. The stone chimney that anchored the western wall was immense, built with a skill that suggested it would stand for another 100 years. Josephine walked around it slowly, her trained eye assessing its strengths and weaknesses. She saw the work that needed to be done, the daunting scale of it, but she did not feel despair. She felt a flicker of something else, something she hadn't felt since Thomas died. Purpose. She pushed the heavy door inward. It scraped and groaned across the packed earth floor. The inside smelled of damp stone, dry rot, and the faint, lingering scent of animals that had taken shelter there. A single large room stretched out before her, its vastness broken only by the massive stone fireplace that dominated the far wall. Dust motes danced in the thin shafts of moonlight that pierced the gloom. Empty shelves, their wood warped and gray, lined the long walls. A few rusted barrel hoops lay in a corner. In the center of the room, The dirt floor was scattered with leaves and the droppings of squirrels and raccoons. It was desolate, empty, cold. But it was hers. It was the first thing in her life that was truly, entirely hers. She set down her carpet bag, the sound muffled by the dirt floor. She ran a hand along one of the logs of the wall. The surface was rough, scored with the marks of the adze that had shaped it. It felt solid, real. This was not the polished, suffocating finery of the Marsh House. This was a place of work, a place of substance. That night, she did not bother with a fire. She was too tired. She swept a space clear with a pine bough, laid down her blanket, and curled up with her bag as a pillow. The wooden whippoorwill pressed into her palm. The wind howled outside, rattling the loose door and whistling through the empty window frames. But for the first time in a month, she slept a deep and dreamless sleep, sheltered by the sturdy, forgotten walls. Her first days were a ritual of reclamation. She rose with the sun, her breath pluming in the frigid air, and set to work. Survival was a series of small, practical problems to be solved. First, water. She remembered Thomas mentioning a spring nearby, and after a short search, she found it. A steady trickle of clear, cold water emerging from a fissure in a rock outcropping, pure and clean. Next, shelter from the wind. She used Thomas's flannel shirt, tearing it into strips to stuff into the chinking between the logs where the old daubing had crumbled away. She sacrificed her spare dress to tack over the largest of the empty window frames, a flimsy but necessary barrier against the relentless drafts. Fire was life. The great stone hearth was her salvation. The chimney drew perfectly, a testament to its builder. She spent hours gathering firewood, her hands growing raw as she dragged fallen branches and broke them down to size. The first fire she lit in that hearth was a victory. It pushed back the oppressive cold and filled the cavernous room with a flickering, living light, its smoke rising straight and true into the gray sky. She sat before it, mesmerized by the flames, feeling a warmth that was more than just physical. It was the warmth of self-reliance. Each task revealed another. The packed earth floor, while solid, was uneven and damp in places. She spent an entire day leveling it, using a flat piece of slate as a scraper, tamping it down until it was firm and relatively smooth. She explored every inch of her new domain, her carpenter's eye cataloging its flaws and its hidden strengths. It was while she was examining the hearth, planning how she might repair the crumbling mortar, that she first noticed the anomaly. The stone wall that formed the back of the fireplace was a massive, solid construction. But to the left of the firebox, extending about 6 feet, the pattern seemed subtly different. The stones were of the same local granite, but the mortar joints were slightly thinner, the color a shade lighter, as if the work had been done at a different time, by a different hand. Her father had taught her to trust such inconsistencies. "A man's work is like his signature, Josie," he'd said. "No two are exactly alike." She ran her fingers over the surface. It was cold and solid. She tapped each stone with the handle of her father's whetstone. Thud, thud, thud. And then, from one large, squarish stone near the floor, a distinctly different sound, a hollow, resonant boom. Her heart gave a single, hard thump against her ribs. She tapped it again, listening intently. It was unmistakable. There was a space behind it, a current of quiet excitement, sharp and clear, cut through her grief and fatigue. She worked with methodical patience. Using the rusted iron pry bar she'd found in a corner, she began to chip away at the mortar around the hollow-sounding stone. It was slow, arduous work. The mortar was old and hard, and her makeshift tool was clumsy. Her knuckles were scraped raw against the rough granite, and her shoulders ached with the effort. But she did not stop. The sun moved across the sky, its light shifting through the empty windows as she focused on her task. Finally, after hours of chipping and prying, the stone shifted. She put her full weight on the bar, and with a low groan of protest, the stone scraped outward, revealing not earth and foundation, but a dark, narrow void. The air that breathed out from the opening was stale, cold, and smelled of dust and dry paper. It was the smell of a place that had been sealed for a long, long time. She worked more quickly now, her breath coming in short, sharp bursts. She removed 2 more stones above the first, creating an opening just large enough to squeeze through. She needed light. She took a splinter of resinous heart pine from her kindling pile, lit it in the hearth, and holding the flickering torch before her, she slid through the narrow gap into the darkness beyond. The hidden room was small, no more than 6 feet by 8, and surprisingly dry. The clever construction of the main chimney had kept it free from moisture for years. Her torch cast dancing shadows on rough stone walls. The space was not empty. In the center sat a heavy, iron-strapped chest, the kind a military paymaster would use. On top of it rested a stiff leather satchel and a cylindrical tin map case, both covered in a thick layer of dust. For a long moment, Josephine simply stood there, the pine torch dripping sparks onto the stone floor, her mind struggling to comprehend what she was seeing. This was not some settler's forgotten cache of preserves. This was something else entirely. She set the torch in a crevice between 2 stones and knelt before the chest. It was locked with a heavy iron padlock, rusted solid. It would be impossible to open without better tools. She turned her attention to the satchel. The leather was dry and cracked, but the buckles, though tarnished, were intact. With trembling fingers, she undid them. Inside, wrapped in oilskin, were several ledgers and a bundle of letters tied with a faded ribbon. She carefully unwrapped the top ledger. The book fell open to a page of neat, precise script. It was a record of payments, dates, and names, but what made her breath catch in her throat was the heading at the top of the page. Department of the Army, Office of the Paymaster General, USA. These were Union documents. Here, in the heart of a Confederate supply depot. She turned the page, more entries, and then a name she knew. C. Marsh, Payment for Information Wrecked Movement of 17th Virginia Infantry. Her blood ran cold. She flipped through the pages, her eyes scanning the meticulous records. The name appeared again and again. C. Marsh, for maps of local fortifications. C. Marsh, for roster of local militia leadership. Cyrus Marsh, the staunch Confederate patriot, had been selling information to the Union. Beneath the ledgers was the bundle of letters. On top was a sealed envelope, addressed simply to whoever finds this. She broke the brittle wax seal. The letter was from a Union captain named Elias Vance, dated April 1865. He wrote that he was an intelligence officer and paymaster, betrayed by his local contact, a merchant named Cyrus Marsh, who had led him into a Confederate ambush. Wounded and trapped, Vance had hidden the operational funds, his intelligence files, and this letter, hoping a loyal patrol would find it. Mr. Marsh is a man of no loyalty save to the dollar, he wrote. He has played both sides for his own enrichment. The gold in the chest is federal property. The ledgers are the proof of his treason. Use them to see justice done. I fear I will not survive the day. The letter was signed with a hand that grew unsteady at the end. Here, in this cold, secret room, was the truth behind the Marsh fortune. The foundation of Cyrus's power was not brilliance, but betrayal, and she was holding the proof. She sat on the cold floor of the hidden room for what felt like an eternity, the torch sputtering beside her, Captain Vance's letter in her hand. The world had tilted on its axis. The man who had cast her out, who held the entire valley in his financial grip, was a traitor who had built his empire on the blood of his own neighbors. The sheer scale of his deception was dizzying. But as the initial shock subsided, it was replaced by a cold, clear certainty. This was not just a secret. It was leverage. It was power. But it was a dangerous power. To simply walk into town and accuse Cyrus Marsh would be suicide. He would deny everything, and she would be dismissed as a hysterical, grieving widow. He would have her silenced, one way or another. No, her father had taught her to build things to last. If she was going to act, she had to build a case as carefully as he would have built a house, with a solid foundation and every piece fitted perfectly into place. Her first priority was to secure her position. She needed to make the depot a defensible home, and she needed resources. The gold was the key. She turned her attention back to the paymaster's chest. The lock was formidable, but her father had also taught her about mechanics, about weak points and leverage. She studied the rusted padlock, identifying the pin that held the shackle in place. Using her iron pry bar and a heavy, flat stone as a hammer, she began to strike at that single point, over and over. The sound was deafening in the small space. It was brutal, exhausting work, but her desperation gave her strength. Finally, with a sharp crack, the rusted metal gave way. The lock sprang open. She lifted the heavy lid. Inside, nestled in felt lining, were stacks of Union double eagles, their gold surfaces gleaming in the torchlight, as bright and perfect as the day they were minted. It was a fortune. More money than she had ever imagined. She took a single coin, its weight solid and reassuring in her palm, and closed the lid. She would not be reckless. The next day, she sewed 10 of the gold coins into the hem of her dress. She walked for 2 days, not to her old town, but north, to a different town in a different county where she was a stranger. There she carefully made her purchases. She did not buy luxuries. She bought a good felling axe, a bucksaw, a hammer, and a small keg of nails. She bought 2 sacks of flour, a side of bacon, salt, coffee, and a heavy wool blanket. She bought 2 panes of glass, carefully wrapped in an old quilt. She paid for it all with a single gold coin, enduring the merchant's suspicious stare with quiet composure. She hired a man with a cart to haul her supplies to the base of the mountain trail, and from there, she carried everything up to the depot herself, load by grueling load. The physical labor was a balm, focusing her mind and body on the immediate task. She spent the next week transforming the depot. She replaced the broken door hinge, repaired the sagging porch roof, and carefully set the new glass in the 2 main windows, securing them with fresh putty. The depot was slowly becoming a home, a fortress, but she knew she could not do everything alone. She needed help, and more importantly, she needed allies. There was only one person she could think to trust, an old mountain man named Silas Blackwood. Thomas had spoken of him with respect. Silas had lost his farm to Cyrus Marsh in a legal dispute over a decade ago, and had lived as a recluse ever since, nursing a deep and abiding hatred for the man who had ruined him. He was her best, and perhaps only, hope. Finding Silas Blackwood's cabin took another full day of walking. It was tucked away in a high, remote cove, a small, impeccably kept log house with a thread of smoke rising from its chimney. Silas himself was as weathered and sturdy as the mountains he lived in. He answered her knock with a long rifle held loosely in his hands, his eyes narrowed with suspicion. He was a tall, gaunt man in his 60s, with a beard the color of frost and eyes as pale and clear as ice. "What you want?" he asked, his voice a low rumble. Josephine did not flinch. She met his gaze directly. "My name is Josephine Marsh, Thomas's widow." Recognition flickered in his eyes, followed by a flicker of pity, which he quickly suppressed. "I heard what Cyrus did to you," he said. It was not a question. "I've taken the old depot at Miller's Gap," she said, keeping her voice steady. "The roof needs work I can't do alone. I'll pay you for your time, in coin." She showed him one of the gold pieces. He stared at the coin, then back at her face, his expression unreadable. He saw a young woman, alone and in mourning, but he also saw something else, a resolve that reminded him of the ancient granite of the mountains. He saw she was not afraid. "Cyrus Marsh is a poison in this valley," he said at last, lowering the rifle. "Any enemy of his is a friend of mine. I'll help you, not for your gold, but for the principle of the thing." He agreed to come the next morning. It was the beginning of her first alliance. Silas was a master of woodcraft, and together they worked on the depot's roof. He showed her how to split cedar shakes with a froe and mallet, and she, in turn, showed him a clever trick her father had taught her for bracing a sagging beam. They worked in a comfortable silence, their communication flowing through the shared rhythm of their labor. A bond of mutual respect formed, unspoken but solid. One evening, as they sat by the fire, Silas told her of others who had been wronged by Cyrus. A doctor whose practice had been ruined by rumors Marsh had started. A family whose land had been seized over a debt that had been mysteriously inflated. He was painting a map of Cyrus Marsh's quiet reign of terror. A few days later, Silas brought a visitor. It was the doctor he had mentioned, a man named Alistair Finch. Dr. Finch was elderly now, his hands stooped with age, but his eyes were sharp and intelligent. He had come out of a sense of duty, hearing that Thomas Marsh's widow was living alone in the mountains. Josephine knew this was a critical moment. After they had shared a simple meal of bacon and cornbread, she made her decision. She led Dr. Finch to the hearth, opened the hidden room, and showed him what she had found. She watched his face as he read Captain Vance's letter. His hands began to shake. "Elias Vance," he whispered, his voice thick with emotion. "He was my cousin. We all thought he'd deserted with the payroll. His name was disgraced." He looked up at Josephine, his eyes shining with tears. "For 15 years, Cyrus Marsh has let my family live with that shame, knowing it was his own lie." In that moment, Josephine gained more than an ally. She gained a strategist. Dr. Finch knew the law, and he knew the people of the valley. He understood that the ledgers were more powerful than the gold. Together, the three of them, the widow, the recluse, and the disgraced doctor, began to plan. News traveled slowly in the mountains, but it traveled surely. People began to appear at her door. Martha Pringle, a widow whose husband had died in the logging accident that had been blamed on his own carelessness, brought a warm stew and a pair of woolen socks. A young farmer, whose family was about to lose their land to Marsh's bank, arrived one morning and silently chopped a month's worth of firewood for her. They were a quiet coalition of the dispossessed, drawn to the flickering light of the depot, a place that was becoming a symbol of defiance. They did not speak of rebellion. They spoke in the language of shared work and small kindnesses. They were building a community, one act of mutual support at a time, strengthening the foundation for what was to come. The confrontation, when it came, was as quiet and deliberate as Josephine herself. There was no public denunciation, no dramatic showdown in the center of town. Dr. Finch had advised against it. Cyrus is a cornered animal, he'd warned. If you attack him publicly, he'll lash out and destroy everything he can. We must simply show him the walls of the cage. Following the doctor's plan, Josephine selected a single page from Captain Vance's ledger. It was an entry from October 1864, detailing a payment to C. Marsh for information on the precise location of a Confederate supply train, a train that had been subsequently ambushed and destroyed, resulting in the deaths of a dozen local men, including Martha Pringle's grandfather. The entry was damning in its specificity. The date, the amount paid, and the nature of the intelligence. Josephine folded the page neatly and placed it in an envelope. Alongside it, she placed a single, gleaming Union double eagle from the paymaster's chest. She gave the envelope to Silas, who rode down to the valley in the dead of night and left it on the doorstep of the Grand Marsh house. Then they waited. They did not have to wait long. The effect was immediate and catastrophic. For Cyrus Marsh, the envelope was not a threat. It was a ghost. It was the arrival of a judgment he had outrun for 15 years. He knew with sickening certainty that this was not a bluff. Whoever had sent it had the rest of the proof. The gold coin was a clear signal that they had the federal funds as well. Exposure was unthinkable. In the post-war South, a man could be a scoundrel, a cheat, even a killer, and still command respect. But a traitor who had sold out his own people, his own neighbors, for Yankee gold, that was a stain that could never be washed away. His power, built on the illusion of Confederate loyalty and financial acumen, would evaporate overnight. He would be a pariah, hunted and despised. His empire would crumble to dust. Within a week, the town began to stir with rumors. Cyrus Marsh was selling his assets. The timber mill, the bank, his vast land holdings, all were being liquidated at a fraction of their value. The buyer was a mysterious consortium from Richmond, represented by a lawyer no one had ever seen before. In reality, the lawyer was an old colleague of Dr. Finch, and the consortium was funded by carefully laundered gold from the paymaster's chest. The money Cyrus had gained through betrayal was now being used to systematically dismantle his life's work. One morning, the town awoke to find the great white house on the hill empty. Cyrus Marsh and his remaining family were gone, vanished in the night, leaving behind only shuttered windows and the wreckage of a disgraced legacy. The valley breathed a collective sigh of relief. The weight of Cyrus Marsh's influence was lifted, and in its place, something new began to grow. The bank, under the new ownership of the consortium, began renegotiating debts, allowing families to keep their farms. The mill was reopened as a cooperative, with the workers sharing in the profits. The money from the chest, managed wisely by Dr. Finch, was used not to enrich one person, but to heal the community Cyrus had bled for so long. Josephine remained at the depot. It was no longer a place of exile but a true home, warm and secure, its shelves stocked, its windows bright against the mountain darkness. She became a quiet, respected figure in the valley. People knew her story, not in all its detail, but they knew she was the woman who had, through some unknown means, broken Cyrus Marsh's hold. They treated her with a mixture of awe and deep respect. She asked for nothing, but her woodshed was always full, and gifts of smoked ham, fresh baked bread, and jars of preserves often appeared on her porch. She was no longer the outcast widow. She was Josephine of the Mountain, a woman who had found her power not in wealth or in vengeance, but in quiet integrity and the strength of her own two hands. Winter finally arrived, blanketing the mountains in a deep, silent layer of snow. Josephine stood on the porch of her home, a cup of hot coffee warming her hands, and looked out over the transformed world. The air was clean and cold, the sky a brilliant, cloudless blue. The depot was warm and solid behind her, the scent of baking bread and burning hickory drifting from the chimney. In her pocket, her fingers found the smooth, familiar shape of the carved whippoorwill Thomas had given her. On the mantelpiece inside, next to a vase of dried mountain wildflowers, sat the tin map case left behind by Captain Elias Vance. She thought of the men whose legacies now shared her hearth. Her father, who had taught her to see the truth in things. Her husband, who had taught her to love the wildness of the mountains. And the Union captain, a stranger whose final act of honor had given her a future. They were all gone, yet they were all with her. Cyrus Marsh had believed value was something you took from others. These men had taught her that true value lies in what you build, what you protect, and what you stand for. The $20 and the worthless deed had been meant as an insult, a final act of dismissal. But they had been a gift. They had sent her to the one place where the truth was buried, waiting for someone with the skill to see it and the courage to unearth it. Josephine Marsh was 19 and had been made a widow. She had been given $20 and sent into the wilderness to die. It was the best $20 anyone had ever spent. It makes you wonder, doesn't it? What overlooked corners of our own lives hold the keys to everything we need?